Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here with Lisa Sachs, Director of the Columbia Centre on Sustainable Investment, to discuss our series, Does Sustainable Investing Work? So Lisa, thank you so much for joining me on your travels today. And to start off, could you maybe tell us a bit about the Columbia Centre on Sustainable Investment and what your role is there?
Yes, first of all, it's a pleasure, and I'm learning so much from what you've been writing for those of us in this field. So it's really a pleasure to talk with you today. So yes, I've been at the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment that I now direct for 16 years, I think. And we are a applied research center at Columbia University. We span multiple disciplines. We sit at the law school, but we are joint with the climate school and with the policy school, and we work with the engineers, and we work with all different faculty throughout the university to work on achieving sustainable development, but with a particular focus on the role of investment in achieving sustainable development. And that means, where is investment needed, with what qualities, with what characteristics, and how do we achieve that? What does that mean in terms of the legal framework, the policy framework, the practices of different economic actors, and so on? So we take a very holistic look at the challenge of mobilizing investment for sustainable development and work with all different stakeholders to see how we can progressively move from where we are, unfortunately, to where we need to be in the future.
Okay, that's great. And we're going to come back to talk about some of the conclusions that you've drawn from that work. But I'd like to start with your reactions to the series of articles we put together on, does sustainable investing work? And we'll put a link to the original article and my discussion with Harald Walkate in the show notes, which gives more on this. And I mean, just to summarize, our review of the academic evidence on sustainable investing suggested that some of the conventional tools that are used struggle to create real world impact on environmental or social issues. And here we're talking about things like divestment from or engagement with dirty companies. So either the effects on companies are too weak to be noticed at all, or, for example, management only responds to the signals that investors are sending to them with a limited degree, which is consistent just with long-term value creation. Or maybe changes at the company level are just offset elsewhere in the system by competitors or state-owned actors. And this kind of led us to conclude that sustainable investors wanting to be impactful on issues like climate have to be kind of realistic about what they can achieve and how much influence they can have. So in your work at the Columbia Center, you've looked at this whole question of sustainable investing from a number of different perspectives. So I'd love to get your reactions. So let's maybe start with the positives. What do you think we got right in our analysis?
Most, if not all of it. No, a lot. And what I think you've done, well, what's interesting is I think you've done even more than you arguably set out to do, because you make some actually pretty fundamental points at the introduction to the first and at the conclusion of the last that I think are part of the big points you're making. One of the points you make at the introduction of the first blog is that even the concept of sustainable investing means different things to different people, and that it doesn't even always mean, or what has been termed ESG investing or sustainable investing, often those are used, unfortunately, interchangeably. But even the idea that what it means is trying to affect change is not necessarily universally true. And you say some people, what they mean by ESG and sustainable investing is just incorporating quote unquote non-traditional considerations, environmental and social considerations in their investment decisions, or they are aligning their investment decisions with their moral values, which I have absolutely no problem with. There are many sectors I personally don't want to be profiting from. And then you narrow in on one definition of sustainable investing, which is trying to affect change. And while that is, so I'm going to stick to your question of what you get right. That is all extremely helpful. And then I think you draw I think it's in the last of your blogs, you say, I'll paraphrase because I don't have it in front of me, that that for anyone who wants to believe that voluntary action is going to solve our problems, the evidence is disheartening. And I think, alas, that's absolutely right. It's not that we should throw out the concept of voluntary actions. It's not that there are not responsibilities for many different stakeholders and things that different actors can do. But I think you very rightfully highlight the limitations of voluntary approaches to sustainable investing if for those who want to affect real change through these types of practices. So anyway, underneath that, you get a lot else right, I will say, in really helpfully unpacking all of the layered assumptions that have to be true for the theory of change to work. So it's not, there are many different pieces of the puzzle, as you rightfully highlight, that even if A is true, B also has to be true. And even if A and B are true, C has to be true. And the evidence is very weak under each one of those. So I think your conclusions in that respect are important for us to reflect on.
So in that answer, you were itching to get on to what we got wrong or what we. Let's get on to that. So what did we get wrong?
So first, I will say, alas, it is probably a small segment of quote unquote sustainable investing practices that I think are really trying to thoughtfully have impact through their investment, and that are being as strategic as you somewhat assume, or as you describe. I shouldn't say you assume, but you describe, what you describe is, even if one were extremely intentional in using all of the resources one could to affect change, even then the outcomes are limited. And I would maybe say that we don't even have a good launch pad for your rocket analogy, which is that I think that there are many, even the motivations that underpin sustainable investing and the incentives that drive those who are engaging, and the myriad complex considerations that they have to take into account when they are doing their engagement or investment allocations and so on. I think it's probably not the case that so many investors are even trying to achieve that impact. And that just, to my mind, that's important because I think that because it even further undermines the idea that voluntary action or the action of investors can solve problems. That would be one point. And then the second is not what you got wrong, but what I look forward to adding to your framework. It's not what's wrong. It's, so then what? Because I think a major important conclusion is, so you asked the question, you're asking the question helpfully from the perspective of investors who may be trying to achieve impact, and helping them understand that there are limitations to what they can do, but what can they do that may be more helpful? So certain types of engagement, certain types of positive, proactive lobbying for favorable, or stop lobbying against climate policy. But from my perspective, we work with the investment community a lot, but my motivations are to achieve sustainable development. So what I'm asking, and the framework that the lens that I would add to your analysis, is not, okay, so what else can investors do, but what does the world need to do? And what can and should investors understand about that world that will help them do their job better? Whether they are trying to have impact, frankly, or even whether they're not, how do we align the investments that are needed once we acknowledge that it cannot be done through voluntary action alone?
That's a very interesting point. And I mean, I think it brings us on to a topic that we've kind of exchanged on quite a lot in the past, which is that we have this, conundrum at the moment about the fact that, I think we're broadly in agreement on the societal importance of limiting global warming as close to 1.5 C as we can possibly get to. But we have this fact that government policy is not generally at the moment pushing us towards that outcome. So what is it that you think climate concerned investors or any investors should take away in terms of what you just said about their understanding about what the world needs and where it's going to? What are the areas that they think they should really be focusing on, given that actually the actions required to deliver a 1.5 C world may not be profitable for them today?
Yeah. So it's been thrilling to discuss this with you over many emails and reflections, because it is helping me hone my own thinking on this, because it's not easy. So let me start from what I know and then get to this part that I think is more complicated. What I know is that we are facing we are in a tremendous climate crisis. We are already seeing devastating and extremely costly impacts, not only in terms of financial costs, but of course in loss of lives, livelihoods, land mass, irreversible loss of species, and so on, we are already facing the horrific impacts of climate change, and we are moving toward an unlivable planet. I have young kids, and that thought really scares me because the pace of change is extraordinary, and we're really living the consequences already now. We haven't even hit 1.5 degrees C, which scientists say was a tipping point after which the consequences of climate change could become catalytic and irreversible and so on. And by the way, even if fossil fuel use emissions stopped today, 100%, we would still go past the 1.5 degrees limit because the response time of the atmospheric temperature is delayed from emissions because of the time it takes for the oceans to absorb the emissions and so on. So we are spiraling out of control and facing calamity. What is generally agreed is that what is necessary is to decarbonize by mid-century, decarbonize our global economy by mid-century. That would be extraordinarily challenging, but we have a sliver of feasibility to do that. It will take transformations of our energy systems, of many economic sectors, major public and private investments in a coordinated effort at national scales, importantly at regional scales, because energy systems are largely regional, and then global collaborative efforts. So that's the timeline that we're on as far as I'm seeing. So I look at the problem as we have got to decarbonize by mid-century. How are we going to do that? What does that mean in terms of where the investments are needed? Where are the gaps now? What is public investment? What's private investment? What has to be done through regulation and so on? What I would say the investment community should understand is that reality. And that, by the way, the assessment that we need to decarbonize by mid-century is on the basis of a robust societal cost benefit analytical framework. It accounts for human lives, it accounts for ecological systems, but it also accounts for productivity, cost, technology, and so on. So in a way, it incorporates certain factors of the market. I am less concerned about what's optimal for financial returns. Actually, not only am I less concerned, I'm not concerned about what's optimal for financial returns in the market. I'm concerned about what's optimal from a societal perspective. What I think investors could understand, and I will stop here and then we can continue, but what I think that they should understand is that this is the framework in which they're investing. This is the framework. I see investors largely as market takers. They are not going to solve these problems. They are not going to, I'm not unfortunately looking to any of them to make the policy or to drive the actions. They are market takers. But as market takers, thoughtful investors should understand the market. And this is the market. It's not only the world we see today. It's the world we see today and the world we're moving to mid-century, and all of the societal pressures that are going to be on governments, companies, and so on as the crisis gets worse and the timeline gets shorter. So I think wise investors should be aware of that. And what does that mean? It means stop undermining those goals. Stop undermining it. That is morally reprehensible. And stop betting against it. That's bad business. That's my short.
I'd like to pick up on a couple of those things, because I'll come back to the stop undermining it, because I think I'd love to have a discussion with you about the role of investors in policy formation and that sort of thing. But I'm going to start with the betting against it.
Yeah.
Because I think that, this is the thing where I think there's a real kind of difference in views amongst investors, right? And this question of what is the fiduciary duty of an investor comes into play here. Because I think most investors who aren't living under a rock would accept that the world is on some kind of decarbonisation trajectory. Okay, so it is happening. We have both, gradual regulatory ratcheting, but also technology developments that mean that we're in a very different place on decarbonisation than we were even in 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so a sensible investor has to take that into account. But the other thing that is also true is that notwithstanding the sort of societal desirability of, let's say, a 1.5C target, we're also clearly not on track for that either. So an investor who's a sort of a taker rather than a maker, in a sense, should be betting against the 1.5C scenario because it's kind of unlikely, and they should be betting on the most likely scenario. So how do you differentiate between, betting against scenarios versus supporting scenarios that simply aren't credible anymore?
Yeah. These are good, tough questions, as you know, because I've been learning and thinking about them with you. I still start from, first of all, the point where my entry point to this is how do we get there from a policy, framework, a legal framework, a public investment framework. So for those who think that we're not on the right track, it's important to recognize that there are many of us working very hard to get us on that track. And the path to get there is not necessarily going to be linear. So the gap that we face now does not suggest that that's going to be the continuous gap to mid-century. We are working toward rapid catch-up, rapid technological development and deployment, major policy shifts, and so on. And I think that the pressures for that and the enabling environment for that are going to become rapidly more conducive to those rapid changes as populations continue to suffer the consequences of unabated climate change, and as the technology becomes increasingly available and the consequences of not taking action become increasingly evident. What I think and expect is that, for instance, investing in long-term projects that are inconsistent with those trajectories, I do believe those are bad investments, and that making an investment in a new fossil fuel project that's going to take 40 years to realize its profits is probably a bad investment. A different question is, what about the companies that are operating today, not necessarily in the fossil fuel sector, but in other sectors that are not transitioning as rapidly as they should to be on track? They don't themselves have rigorous and robust transition pathways. And here, I think you're right, which is why I'm not looking to the financial markets to solve our problems. I think here, I'm not looking to the financial sector, unfortunately, to get those companies on a curve that's consistent. They're investing in the market that they're in today. And I am working to change that market that they're in today. And what I think is that investors that understand that the market is going to change, it's going to change rapidly, and it's going to change in many different ways. Sectoral regulations that may affect different sectors, the whole energy grid that's going to change, the cost of certain technology is going to change. Those who anticipate that, I think, will be better prepared for that future.
Yeah. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds to me like you're saying, you're just saying to investors, don't underestimate the pace of change here, right? It's very easy to underestimate it. And actually, beyond that, therefore, there's probably advantage for you in leaning into this transition rather than resisting it. I'd just like to push you a little bit on this question of fiduciary duty, because what you've just described is very consistent with conventional definitions of fiduciary duty. And it's really just about having the right foresight about the way in which the wind is blowing. Do you see fiduciary duty as it's currently framed as being a constraint on our efforts to deliver?
Yeah. So
to deliver climate action, or do you view it as a red herring, that whole debate about fiduciary duty?
Yeah. I see it a bit as a red herring, but let me elaborate a little bit. I basically believe in the traditional concept of fiduciary duties, and that's the traditional understanding of fiduciary duties. Or it's not that I believe in it, but I don't think that we're going to depart much from it. That's a better way to put it.
Right.
I I don't think that we are going to get to a place where the financial sector begins to understand their financial and legal responsibilities to their stakeholders as incorporating more than financial return. So I think I'm accepting the traditional concept of fiduciary duty. I don't see that as a constraint because I don't see that fundamentally as a constraint because insightful investors can be planning for this rapid decarbonization, betting on a future that rapidly decarbonizes, betting on certain technologies that will become rapidly available. Let me remind myself to come back to give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
And they may be betting on long-term profits, long-term growth, and so on. And to my mind, that is absolutely consistent with fiduciary duties because they are making their own informed judgment on risk-adjusted return. Let me give you my example on that. As you know, I'm speaking to you today from China. China has invested massively in the future economy. They have invested massively in solar capabilities, in the technologies and so on of the future. Those sectors are not now outperforming. It's not that the profits are extraordinary right now, but in a future world where we are much more heavily renewable energy, which we will be, and even more reliant on those sectors, they will be in the lead. By the way, I'm willing to bet on that. I would put my money on that reality. So that is investing for the future in a way that's consistent with their responsibilities to those whose money they're investing. So I don't see it as a constraint in that way. Where I do see tensions, and I do think that there are tensions that are interesting to unpack, is that for investors who want to be part of the solution, there are some types of investments that right now would be, or there are some types of actions or some types of investments right now that would be difficult to make under very traditional notions of fiduciary duty. For instance, investments in emerging markets, investments in some new technologies that are deemed to be too risky by traditional markets. Those under traditional fiduciary, not only under traditional fiduciary duty understandings, but also under the mandates of certain asset owners and others, they can't make those investments. So I welcome an analytical conversation with those who feel constrained by their fiduciary duties and wanting to make the types of investments that they think are important for the future, not necessarily to mitigate systemic risk, but to actually be a part of the future. I think that it is useful to have a conversation about with policymakers, with their asset owners, with society about whether those types of investments can be consistent with traditional fiduciary duties. That conversation interests me. But the general idea that we're going to solve the problems of financial allocation by redefining fiduciary duties to incorporate more of a responsibility, that I think is neither right nor practical. So it's not my school of thought.
But a more ambitious interpretation of what current fiduciary duty might allow is something you're a bit more interested in, which is sort of interesting.
Yes, and I think that sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, we've just had the Financial Markets Law Commission here in the UK has, recently put out some guidance on interpretation of the existing law on fiduciary duty that did encourage trustees to be a little bit more expansive in how they viewed it. So that certainly feels to me a little bit more of a fruitful place to go. And it coming then on to some of the kind of net zero alliances of investor action. Where do you think they should be focusing? How should they be spending their time?
What I think they could usefully be doing is two things, I would say, based on this conversation. One is help explain the policy framework that's needed, the limitations of voluntary action, the role of the financial sector in the transition, but the critical role of government leadership, regulation, and so on. And part of that should be a commitment to at least stop lobbying against climate action, if not proactively, positively lobby, push, call for, insist on the need for a real plan and a real framework. Because, by the way, that will create tremendous investment opportunities. If the policy framework could set the markets, we would unlock many investment opportunities. So the one thing I think they should do is be clear on the critical role of policy on a real, coherent, multi-sectoral framework for investment for the transition. And then which, by the way, we're nowhere near, because not only do we not have a plan, but because the financial sector and the business sector are heavily lobbying against that in this country. Right. So that's not a simple thing to say that should be their first thing. It's the major thing: stop lobbying against policy. And then the second thing I think they could usefully do is to grapple with these actually tricky questions of fiduciary duty and what is possible for whether it's banks or asset owners or asset managers. The alliances are meant to be members who seemingly want to do something more than the traditional. So if they want to do something more, then let's talk about what that looks like. And where can we strengthen the metrics, the methodologies, the blended finance mechanisms, the credit rating agencies, the understandings of risk? Why can't we do more in the current context, and what could be changed to enable that? I would love for them to foster that dialogue, support that dialogue, but engage with the other stakeholders to achieve that. So that's not what the alliances look like today, but that would be my call to action for them.
I mean, it's interesting, but I mean, some of that does kind of go back to what some of those alliances sort of started off doing, because I mean, I think they were kind of formed pre-Paris to sort of make the investor case for why policy was necessary. I'd like to just briefly come back to the point you made on lobbying, because I think it's an area that is getting much more focus within investor alliances and the PRI and so on and so forth. And what do you think some of the limitations of that are? Because I think there is a little bit of a danger that we're sort of latching onto this as the magic bullet, so voluntary decarbonisation hasn't worked, but policy lobbying will. But where do you think some of the constraints are around this?
Yeah, I think there are real constraints to lobbying. So first of all, by the way, if I could even further simplify, I would rather they just stop lobbying, period. Get the financial sector. If I'm accepting their fiduciary responsibilities, which is to maximize risk-adjusted return, they should not be involved in our policy making. That's, classic. Milton Friedman said, maximize profits under the given constraints, but you don't get to shape those given constraints in that world. So, but we live in a world in which the fiduciary duties are maximize returns, but also we are going to influence the policy framework so that we can shape our world and allow us to continue to have to profit off externalities and so on. So the basic thing is stop undermining the role of government in setting the framework in which investors can do their thing, which is make good risk-adjusted return, financial decisions. So stop lobbying. But to the extent that, and I think that it's okay. And then the second constraint would be that investors have many different considerations that they are optimizing for. To the extent that climate is one of them, which is probably not so many of them, alas, even if they accept the systemic risk argument or whatever. But anyway, there are many things that investors are optimizing for and trying to maximize risk-adjusted returns. So that, to my mind, is a constraint of the lobbying spigot, whatever it's called, being open, which is, do I really believe that the trade associations of the financial sectors are going to have the clearest message on what should be done in terms of a policy framework that is a coherent, aggressive vision for? No. So what would I do instead? What would I suggest instead is that I think that they should be transparent and open about the limitations of what they can do, what they are, what they're trying to do, what they can't do on their own, and what they need government to do. And say that transparently, which, by the way, I have not really seen.
Mm.
When and a couple of years ago, the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, maybe it was 2 years ago or so, put out a statement right before the climate bill was shot down, or right after, whatever. And the statement was calling on governments to step up on climate action. But why had the US bill just failed? Because the business lobby had killed the bill. So have a little more honesty about what's going on right now.
Lisa, that's a great note on which to end the discussion. Thanks so much for
Great.
your time. I've enjoyed it so much. Thanks for joining us.
Great.